Hi, this is Andy Revkin. I run the brand new initiative on communication and sustainability at Columbia University's Earth Institute. And I'm here today with some pretty wise people trying to figure out how to make information matter around the emerging and emergent and explosive puzzle that is the coronavirus, COVID-19, and the disease that has spread in a matter of moments from some biological interaction in Wuhan, China, led to a disruption of everything we know about the world, basically. Just last week, the first death of a Yanomami Indian in the Amazon occurred from COVID-19. So just think about that geography there, how this has happened. There are people in Bar Harbor, Maine, this tiny town in Maine, who are trying to breed mice to capture the genetic that could be used to solve the genetic puzzle and possibly lead to a vaccine. So from rural Maine to the middle of the Amazon, we're having this giant effect. And you're going to meet and talk to for the next hour some interesting people. Tomás Pueyo, who had an influential role in spreading an understanding of the basic need to do two things in sequence here as the world gets at this problem: the hammer of lockdown, the hammer of shelter in place, the hammer of shutting down economies completely, essentially, to the dance, which is, I think, what we were hoping for. Meaning, how do you move from that total lockdown to starting to open societies, create some activity, but with vigilance and surveillance and testing and isolation as needed. So it's from the hammer to the dance. And I've had the links to Pueyo's pieces on medium.com that kind of illustrated this pretty clearly and got a lot of attention, which seems like months ago, but was just a few weeks ago. And Howie Frumkin, who was at the University of Washington for a long time, he's now emeritus, and has a book coming out, a co-written book on planetary health later in the summer, I think. And Howie has a background in epidemiology. He ran the National Center for Environmental Health at one point under Obama administration, I believe, or the early, maybe first
Obama.
Yes. And Angela Rasmussen, who's a virologist, who's dug in on, the key long-term question, which is how do you elucidate a pathway to stamping this out, a vaccine. One of the big questions here too is if we don't have vigilance, if we don't move to an effective dance, this can become an endemic thing. It's not novel. It won't be novel anymore. It'll be part of the biological landscape of the North America and the world for essentially like West Nile virus and other things with odd names that we now seem unremarkable. But this is the most remarkable thing. So I just wanted to start briefly with Tomás because, I first reached out to you in the context of the communication question here. So what prompted you to tackle this? And just kind of sketch very briefly the journey from what you were doing to how you got involved with this coronavirus puzzle.
Yeah. I used to write blog posts on the side on all kinds of topics. And at the beginning of February, when suddenly the coronavirus was exploding everywhere, I started paying more attention every day. I started posting a little bit of content on Facebook with my friends, and every day it was growing in interest and attention. So I stopped doing all the other stuff that I was doing on the side. And then after posting the article on Medium, then it exploded so much that I just started doing that. In fact, right now I took holidays from work to just do this, because otherwise it's just impossible to cope with all the attention that it has garnered.
And am I correct that you're involved with or helped to start a company that's a sort of online learning?
I work at one. It's a reasonably big one, actually. But yeah, I between the fact that I was sick and then this and then the fact that I have 3 kids at home, it's just impossible to do it all.
Yeah, everyone's trying to do more than is possible right now. So Angela, it's always good to start with the biology and then build out to the human biology and the human behavior questions. So, you've been thinking about viruses way before this particular iteration emerged. What's your latest thinking on perhaps on what we don't yet understand about it that's really important?
Well, the things that I'm thinking about, and especially that I think are relevant to what Tomás has written about, are the questions of immunity. So how immune are people who recovered from COVID? We do know that many people make antibodies. We do know that in some of those cases, at least, those antibodies appear to be protective, but it's a really open question in terms of figuring out when we can all sort of start cycling back into the workplace, how many people actually have these antibodies and how much protection they'll provide. And that long term is really relevant in terms of developing an effective vaccine. And the signs so far are looking very good in terms of vaccine development. Things are rushing ahead. But there are some cautionary tales to kind of keep in mind from development of vaccine for SARS Classic. At least one vaccine had actually made disease worse in a non-human primate model. So I've been thinking a lot about immunity lately, and also just sort of the ethics of making the assumption that people who have antibodies are immune, that immunity is always protective, and sort of what the implications are in terms of issuing immunity certificates or just telling people that it's safe to sort of resume at least big parts of their previous normal life.
Yeah, there's so much. This gets to the human behavior part. This will be a good segue to how we, there's been exploitation of, there's been a press tendency to hyper-focus on the question of when do we open up, and when you think about what would have to happen for that to happen, knowing both what's known about the disease and what's still unknown about it, it seems way more complicated than most of the descriptions have been. Of course, the president was saying, Easter, and now I don't know if he's saying Memorial Day. I don't know what he's saying on an hourly basis, but others too, the headline tendencies of the media, which I was in for, am in still for 30 decades, are all about distillation and crystallization and simplification. So Howie, having been in governmental roles in academia and with a background in epidemiology, and knowing about the human mind and how it responds or doesn't respond, is there something you see as a vital next step before we even think about relaxing the patterns that are under effect right now?
Well, starting with the human mind, Andy, I think one of the toughest pieces that everybody's confronting now is the lack of predictability. We don't know when this is going to let up, and people can hunker down for a week or 2 weeks or even a month if they know that there's an endpoint. But without knowing the endpoint, it's very tough for people. That said, I don't think we need to be focusing on a date as much as on data. There are certain conditions that we'd want to be met before we start relaxing. We'd want the curve to be flattened, to use the common parlance. That is, the transmission rate needs to be nice and low so that we're not getting an exponential increase in cases. In fact, we're getting a stabilization and a decrease. We would really want to have test capacity so that we can then enter what Tomás has so nicely called the dance phase of extensive testing. And we'd want to have the people power in place so that we could do the contact tracing and quarantine the people who have been contacts of those who are sick. We also want to have the healthcare system up and able to handle as many cases as it may get. And we want to have all the supplies in the supply chain that we need, the swabs, the reagents, personal protective equipment. So there's a lot of preparation to do that we need to finish before we're ready to loosen up. And we want to get the case transmission under control before we loosen up. So there's both an epidemiologic piece of it and a logistics piece of it.
And I think it's fair to say that we're already seeing little micro experiments in what happens if you don't have a certain approach in place. South Dakota, Sioux Falls, and other places where you've seen emergent hotspots. One hopes that could tip the balance toward more rigor in the policy end, but I still wonder, Tomás, when the reactions you got to your piece, I think it did help dramatically to drive forward the conversation around how to shape policy. But when policy is still, even in the United States, we have this battle right now between governors and the president. And individually, you see all kinds of wacky responses to what seems so rational
Yeah.
in a modeled way. So what's the next communication challenge? Like, are you writing another piece? What would it look like? What would it look like to write a?
So yeah, no, I my third piece was about that specifically. Out of many, one focused on the US, specifically what was happening here. And I focused on it, A, because I live here, but B, because it was the biggest country that was adopting a strategy that wasn't very clear. Specifically, what was happening here is that the sovereign level that everywhere else had taken the measures, which corresponds to the federal state, did not take the measures that we were expecting to, that every single other country had. And then here it was more like, hey, states, you do what you want. And that has a lot of issues. One of them is that the states obviously were not ready. The other one is that just structurally, there's a few things, especially in a crisis, that make more sense at the highest possible level. One of them being you actually want to be the one coordinating all the supply. You want to be the one buying all the ventilators, the one buying all the masks, because otherwise you have each one of the states fighting against each other, bidding against each other. The richer ones and the ones that are hit first are going to be buying everything, and then the poor ones are going to be left out. And then on top of this, there was a rural-urban divide, where urban areas were hit first and had more spread early on. But history says that rural areas never get or don't usually get spared with this kind of epidemic. And so it was just a matter of time before it reached these areas. And the US has an urban-rural divide also for politics. So you ended up having some early polarization, probably to do that then carries on through the epidemic. So it looks like that when talking with actual user, like people, citizens, that polarization is not as true, especially when you're talking about specifics and measures. But all of these has been delayed by all these issues, the politicization and the issue between states and the federal government. Now, thankfully, most states actually did take measures, and I've been talking with some state lawmakers, and really the color was not a huge factor on this. Like, for example, I've talked a bunch more with Alaska than I have with many other states, and they've made a lot of great measures. So yeah, I think the US is really weird in how it reacted to it. Answering just very quickly, your other question is, right now I'm working on another article, but I decided not to focus on the US because it's so hard, especially politically, and instead focusing on what nearly every country in the world is thinking about right now, which is learning how to dance.
Learning how to dance. Howie, when you think about the dance, one thing you and I were talking about maybe a day or two ago was the human capacity actually carry out the task of not just the testing. So there's the mass testing. You have to have tests that are cheap, ubiquitous, quick, and you have to have people to do contact tracing. The other day on Twitter, I tweeted about a guy. There was an interview with a Singaporean contact tracer. And I think a lot of people are assuming, oh, there's an app, it'll just, the majority of this probably will still be done by a person. So how does that happen? Or is there a solution? Is that part of the solution?
Well, it's very much part of the solution. If you think about the hammer to the dance transition, the beauty of the hammer, the beauty of clamping down is that we buy ourselves time. But that's only worth doing if we use the time well. And that means putting preparations in place. And I worry a lot that we haven't done that as much as we need to. So the preparations that have to go into place, we have to have testing capability. That's a technical issue, but there have to be enough people to administer the tests. And the volume estimates range from a couple of million up to 20 million a day. If we want to do the level of testing that we need, certainly starting with the high-risk people, but population-wide testing as well. So that's a part of the workforce that we need. Then when people test positive, they need to be sequestered away from everybody else till they get better. and all their contacts need to be traced. And that's the big piece that you just mentioned, Andy. So there's another big workforce issue. We need a small army of contact tracers. This is a time-honored tradition in epidemiology, back from the days of sexually transmitted diseases, when one of the things you did was put your public health workforce on the case. Each time there's a case of a disease, you ask who they were in contact with, and you go to those individuals and you isolate them. You quarantine them until you know that they're either well or they get through their illness. It takes a lot of people. So it reminds me of back to the days of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the WPA. We actually have a lot of people out of a job in the country right now.
Right.
And in theory, it shouldn't be hard to train those people. This is not super complicated work to do. It takes human skills as much as anything, and get those people on the job. Now, there are some apps that can be helpful in doing that. Some can be seen as invasive to people's privacy and civil liberties. And that's a tough issue for us in this country, more than in some other countries. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to human contact, expressing concern for those people who have been in contact with a case, persuading them that they need to stay home. And then, importantly, another part of our preparation for the dance, providing the support that you need when you're stuck at home for 2 weeks. If you don't have somebody to go do your shopping for you, you need to have groceries delivered. Same with medications, same with basic supplies. So that's another piece we need to be getting in place right now as well.
Yeah, I think Ezra Klein at Vox wrote a pretty good piece. There was also a very scary piece about the reality check of this, like to get to that dance, to have a really fine, artful dance that really does give us the capacity to have a back to open society, open economy, requires perhaps not as much time as it'll take to get the vaccine, but a lot of time and a lot of money. I'm going to try to tweet what you just said about the idea of the Civilian Conservation Corps. If you could have Zoom training for people to do the contact tracing, that would be interesting. Although even now, like just a week or two ago, a neighbor of mine who I had on this program recently, she's a yoga instructor. Imagine the contact tracing there, who was sick along with her teenage son and daughter, and they were recovering. And the only interaction they had with health officials was a phone interview. So, boy, that seems again like a long way to go. Angela, could you give a little snapshot of, even I at Columbia University now don't have a full perspective of what we bring to this story. The public health folks, the virology, the Earth Institute and the National Disaster Preparedness Center are on the same campus. Well, not the same geography, but we don't talk to each other often. So, what's your snapshot of what's happening in academia, not just at Columbia, but in your networks,
right,
to get at this?
So most of the work right now, and the work that I'm personally involved in, has to do a lot with either developing diagnostic testing, developing tests that you can use to look at antibodies and to try to evaluate immunity. And what I'm personally doing is looking at animal models so that we can start testing some of these drug candidates and vaccines. Now, while the vaccine trials have been fast-tracked, and now people are actually having conversations that I never thought I would hear people having, such as contemplating doing human challenge trials, for example, we still really, really need to have animal models to evaluate all of these different vaccine and therapeutic candidates before launching them wide scale on a population level. We need to make sure that they're safe and that they work, at the very least, because we've already heard from both Tomás and Howie that there are substantial logistical and just human needs that we need. We need those resources. So we can't be spending a lot of time scaling up production and distribution of a vaccine or a therapeutic that isn't going to work, at the very least. So what myself and my colleagues are doing are primarily lab work to support that. I mean, of course, I'm not doing lab work right now since I'm stuck in Seattle. But that is what is going on in our center for sure at the School of Public Health. I know that that's what's also going on in the Department of Microbiology across the street where I did my Ph.D. And that is in contact with physicians and people at the hospital who are actually providing clinical care to patients. The convalescent plasma trials are getting started at Columbia as well as throughout New York and throughout the country, really. So a lot of people are doing work also to support those types of trials. So identifying antibody positive people who can be plasma donors, assessing those antibodies for their ability to neutralize virus or provide protective immunity, and so forth. And then ways to evaluate how well those therapies are working for these clinical trials. So that's where most of the research is right now. Longer term, I think we're going to start to see some people asking some really more basic biological questions about how the virus even works, as well as asking questions about the origin of the virus. So how did it emerge? What species did it emerge from? How is it circulating in nature? And how can we avoid exposure to another potential spillover event?
So you brought up an important point that's been in the headlines again. Some of the mainstream media are now closing in again on some of these questions about whether this could have been an escapee from a lab in Wuhan as opposed to something generated in that zoonotic environment down the block, a few blocks away in the fish market. So do you have your own sense of the betting there, or is it still way too early to have some clarity?
So there has been a considerable amount of genomic sequence data for the virus genomes posted into public repositories, and a pretty close analysis by a number of really, really good, well-respected phylogenetics virologists, phylogeneticists, has shown that the changes in this virus that occurred that likely led to human adaptation are not likely to have emerged from any kind of lab activity, whether it be intentional, such as engineering a bioweapon. And my opinion of that is that it is completely baseless. This would actually also be a really terrible bioweapon for a lot of other reasons. Yeah. But it also suggests that this virus wasn't passaged extensively in tissue culture. So when people are saying that, oh, it leaked from a lab where they were studying these bat SARS-like coronaviruses, the changes that are in the genome of the virus are not genetic changes that are known to occur when you passage these types of viruses through cell culture, which is what we have to do with viruses to study them in the lab. So there's no evidence that it leaked. It's not completely possible to rule that out conclusively. And my understanding is that the U.S. intelligence community is now investigating that possibility. But there's also no really compelling evidence that I've seen anyways that does suggest that it was the result of a lab accident and not any other type of exposure to an animal, whether it be a bat or some other species that contained the direct ancestor of this virus. It's really important to note that while we have identified a very closely related bat SARS-like coronavirus, this RATG13 virus that people have talked about a lot, that is not a direct ancestor of this virus. This virus diverged from that one a long time ago. So even though it's a very closely related virus, we actually don't have the virus that was in the animal that this virus emerged from.
So all this talk of pangolins and bats and the like is also premature, essentially.
It is. I mean, I think it's probably safe to assume that this virus did originally come from bats. We know that there are very closely related viruses, and we also know that SARS Classic initially came from a bat reservoir. The open question is, did this come from a bat directly to people? Or did it go through another species, pangolins or otherwise? The pangolin data is compelling because one part of the genome that's important for binding a receptor and infecting a cell is very closely related to this virus. But the rest of the virus is very different, or it's not very different, but it's different enough that we know that this is not also a direct ancestor of the virus. So it's very much an open question. And that has really big implications for how to prevent a future emergence of this virus or a very similar virus.
You've raised some very important points, both in the communication front and on the weird need not only to be dealing with the now questions here, like how do we mitigate losses right now? How do we get adequate healthcare right now to people? How do we protect health workers right now adequately? And I always like to add to these discussions a step back moment where we honor the people who are directly in harm's way and who are to a risk that's pervasive, unlike any other war where there's a front where people go, where you get drafted. It's every store clerk. So a brief moment to say thank you to all of them. But you've also raised this key. What this business of the simmering conspiracy theories. I want to circle back to Tomás, who's in Silicon Valley, which is an amazing place in many ways, and has people who are dug in, solving the world's problems in remarkable ways, but also it generates a lot of stuff, a lot of ideas, and not just Elon Musk, who was punished terribly, appropriately for some of the tweets he did, but some of these conspiracy theories get propagated quite loudly out of that part of the world. What's your take on that? You seem to be holding the ground in terms of what you've been working on. But what kind of messaging do you get from friends or the like? You don't have to name them, but do you get buffeted with some of the sort of countervailing? Well, you got to really check this out. This new website says it came out of some nefarious laboratory somewhere or the like. Yeah. Is that something you deal with?
Very much. I did have exactly the instance that you're talking about. I think yes, there's a lot of conspiracy theories here. Nearly everywhere, I would say, and it really becomes a question of judgment for each person. In my case, especially early on, because I'm not an epidemiologist, obviously, a lot of people were questioning who I am and as a result what I say, which, by the way, I think is amazing. Everybody should be doing this, because whenever somebody has this level of suddenly a platform, there should be checks and balances, and people should challenge them. And it's interesting that a piece that came around a week or so after my first one, also from a person that worked in tech and in growth, also started having a lot of traction, but then Medium took it down. It was Medium has a strong position on not spreading rumors, and so you need to be really, really careful to say what's right, but at the same time you also need to go really, really fast, because you need to make decisions very quickly. And so I think for me, the way I solve that is I read very little analysis and a lot of papers. I go straight to the source, so that there's very little misinterpretation layer that I consume. The second thing is I seldom rely on models. Models are great in some circumstances, but when you have very complex situations that you haven't had time to model properly to know what matters or what doesn't matter, you are always going to be simplifying a lot your assumptions, and so the results are going to be only as good as the simplification of your hypothesis. And so the biggest source of data that I use is the real world, and specifically what has happened in other places. And in fact, I think if most countries had done that properly, we wouldn't be where we are, because East Asian countries, most of them had figured out a lot of what needs to be done, especially if Western countries had done something similar early on. Tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people would not have died.
Yeah, and this gets back to, I want to talk to Howie about this too, and there's some good questions coming in. So. I'll try to get to some of those as well. A lot of people have pointed to South Korea, for example, as having an effective response. But I do, having spent time in South Korea, I haven't seen a lot of the coverage say, by the way, South Korea is on a wartime footing 24 hours a day, every year. It's right next to its worst enemy, and it's poised for disaster every day. So the responsiveness and the adherence to government, they had problems too. Remember, there was a cult which impeded some of the initial effective communication even there. But then you take that to the United States, where you do have 50 states. the East and West Coasts feel like they're seceding in some ways right now from the United States if the president tries to get to and controlling and what he's doing. So is it even conceivable in most Western democracies to get to the point of having that kind of responsiveness, that coordination? Howie, does that feel more than wishful? Is it possible?
You know, Andy, I think this goes to one of the most interesting challenges of this entire period of our history. It's core to public health. Here we have an enormous problem, and it's a collective action problem. It's a problem that we can't solve as individuals, but we need coordinated solution. The mechanism that we have to accomplish that is called government. And in a big country like the US, that has to be the federal government. The states can do a lot and will and are doing a lot, but the coordination has to happen at the federal level. Against that is the history of individualism that we have in our culture. It is a strong strand of anti-science and anti-authority thinking that we have now. And then, as you mentioned before, we are living in a stew of misinformation and conspiracy theory, all of which pulls us away from doing things collectively. I think there's a certain social ethic, and it can arise. We've seen it in our history at the time of the Second World War. We've seen it in Britain at the time of the Second World War. So some of the most individualistic countries in the West can pull together, given the right social situation, the right leadership, the right communication, the right messaging. But it's a huge challenge. One of the challenges in the messaging, and I know you know a lot more about this than I do, is what you as an individual, I don't mean you, Andy, but each of us as an individual, what we have to do, we do for ourselves, but we do for each other. So this is a problem we only solve if we do it together. Some of the steps I need to take, like wearing a mask outside, I'm really doing for other people more than for myself.
Right.
And that's a social challenge and a communication challenge, very much, by the way, akin to the challenges of communicating and acting on climate change, where many of the actions that I need to take may not benefit me directly, but I do it for our larger society. We're not necessarily wired that way in this country.
No, I know. And some of that transcends borders. It's been in the UK recently that people were burning 5G cell towers because this rumor, one of the other rumors that has propagated is the spread of 5G high-speed internet is actually what caused this coronavirus outbreak. And people in England, there have been multiple cases of people burning 5G towers, even as we're trying to go online, right? They're attacking the technology that's allowing connectedness. And that feels, that's the far end of the fringe, but it's still, I don't want to get into the politics too much here today. We've done some other sessions on that, but I want to show you something that's a really troubling part of what's happened in the recent atmosphere. There's the acting director of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on Instagram and Twitter posted this. Richard Grinnell posted, signed permission slip to leave your house. And it's a copy of the Constitution. I mean, the Declaration of Independence. And this has been acted on. There in Michigan, you've probably seen some headlines. There have been people who are saying, screw this, we're on our own. It feels like, well, this is kind of why I've created what I'm doing at Columbia. It's I'm building an initiative. It's an initiative, and initially, the idea though is to attack this new information environment in a laboratory way. How can you make information matter? Is mostly right now not a question of a lack of information. It's a question of navigation. It's a question of filters. It's a question of, Facebook is way too big for Facebook to manage. This has been clear for a long time. You create a mechanism with 2.7 billion users, and where you can't just be constantly swatting the flies. So that means that artificial intelligence or some other tools are going to have to be used, and it'll always be a bit of a race. And and someone had posted a comment. Let me see if I can go back to it. It was a good one. Here, Baba12 on Periscope. everyone listening to this talk probably has at least a college degree and is progressive. Maybe not. I'm hoping not just progressives. But I do think, how do we get out of bubbles? How do you create capacities for average people to understand, if not the specifics of virology, the basics? And this is a long, long journey. Kirk Smith at Berkeley, a great environmental health pioneer at Berkeley, I was sitting with him talking about cooking pollution. Several million people a year die early from breathing indoor smoke from fires and biomass cooking. And we were talking about public health, and he was talking about how long it took for hand washing to become the norm, and how long it took for cholera to be linked to defecation. And you would think now, in the information environment we're in now, that we have all the connectedness, we have all the basic knowledge for sure. Even that the flatten the curve graph, I think it goes, an early version of that came out in the 1918 flu. So does that feel, maybe Tomás, this is as closest to your realm in terms of, you think a lot about communication. Do you feel like freaked out by the nature of where we're at in terms of how hard it is to get a signal through the noise? Or do you think it's just a matter of time that we'll figure this out? Or what do you and your colleagues in digital entrepreneurship think about when they think about this?
That is very much my area of expertise. I spent the last 10 years focused on how to create experiences for people to interact with. And I work, for example, in video games for a few years, and that's what a video game is. It's an experience that is actually useless. It doesn't give you any function, but it is structured in a way that it compels you to continue interacting with it. And so the way I see it is, humans are humans, and they have their biases and their ways to think about things. And it is useless to hope against reality. We are how we are, and for us to have an influence on their behavior, you need to understand these things. And that's one of the reasons why I studied storytelling very heavily a few years ago. Stories are the way we've evolved to think and learn. And so if you try to communicate in a way that disrespects the learnings from storytelling, you're going to have a hard time. And I think really that is probably the biggest thing that I put on the table when I wrote my articles. I do very little research myself. I looked at the data, but I look at the research that everybody else is putting out, and then I try to structure it in a way that is compelling. And it happened to be compelling this time. And so I think it's very normal to have, we were talking about conspiracy theories. I think it's very normal. I think it's very normal to have people who will be reluctant to do this coordinated action that we're talking about. I think it's very normal also to have in South Korea, based on what you're saying, a response that is much stronger. It's just the fact that we're humans. And thankfully, that means also that we can influence it. I think, for example, we had a lot of epidemiologists in the UK that were at the top of the government that understood what was happening and what was going to happen from an epidemiologic standpoint, and still were lukewarm on recommending strong measures to the government. And one of the key reasons why they were saying that is they didn't feel confident they could ask the population to consistently respect social distancing measures, right? So the thing there is, you can influence this. If you understand how people think, there's a lot of storytelling that you can give. There's a lot of priming them on structuring the message to influence substantially that reaction. And so it's just a matter of understanding how people think.
That's so interesting. One thing that excites me, it's overwhelming sometimes how this all plays out. But one thing that excites me is particularly that is happening now. And here, clearly, I think we've seen it with what happened with the flatten the curve graph. It started out as a fairly technical thing. You wrote your piece. There's been innumerable creative visualizations showing it in ways that became almost viral. I want to show you a little example from climate communication that I think is relevant too. Here, several years ago, a climate scientist in England, Ed Hawkins, created it's a very simple thing. Over on the right here, you can see it's basically stripes that show through the color gradient temperature change over time, the last 150 years. And, lo and behold, the world is warming. And I thought that was great. And it became everything. You could see it in people created both like ties, decorative ties you could wear. And there was a dress with this pattern. Weather forecasters were wearing the ties, and it's on billboards. And then Alex Radke, a German statistical and climate scientist, said, well, the problem with warming stripes is it stops right now. So it goes from like 1860 till now, and it says the world is warming. He then started doing iterations that take it forward using models and emissions, the trajectories for emissions. You can start to see there are different color gradations going forward if we choose certain paths for emissions. And I think what excites me isn't even that particular innovation. It's just it's this sort of competitive, open dynamic among people who are solution oriented around how to use these tools for impact. And Howie, I remember 10 years ago on my .earth blog at the Times, I was at a South by Southwest thing with Howard Koh and Bob Perciasepi, public health folks. And the thing that came up was how do you visualize public health? How do you make public health a thing that we can act on? And, because it's statistical. Think about the relationship between PM 2.5 particles and stroke. Like, you never point to a stroke and say that stroke was caused by that person breathing fine particle pollution, by the way, also overweight, by the way, also had high blood pressure. But it's in the data. And, the Gates Foundation and others really created this concept of global health indicators and stuff. But I don't think we've yet gotten close to fully integrating that into decision making, which to me, again, swings it back into Tomás's realm. And it also means that the more virologists and statistical scientists and public health officials and communicators talk to each other, the better we'll be. So here we are. I think before we have another 15 minutes or so. So before we end, what would be some next steps that could help in your arena that could kind of take this to a next level? What would be something that, like Howie, what's needed to get that, to inspire the idea of having a workforce that's built around the sustained need for new jobs to solve this problem? Like, is that something you think, what would be a next step there?
Well, let me answer that, Andy, by starting with the last part of our conversation and then moving on. I completely agree with Tomás on the importance of stories. So although all of us are data junkies and we have to have solid evidence behind any decision we make, the evidence is necessary but not sufficient. But I like to say, paraphrasing a good friend, a communications expert, is numbers numb, stories stick. Numbers numb, that's why they're called numbers. Walkers walk and talkers talk, and numbers numb, that's what they do. But stories stick, and visualizations help a lot with that. So how do we get ourselves to the point where we're ready to prepare for the dance? Well, imagine a visualization, and you don't have to imagine it because we've all seen some of these recently, of a case, a dot, then ramifying out to 3 or 4 other dots, depending on what the R value is, and each of those 3 or 4 more. You can visualize dynamically the exponential spread of a disease very easily, and you can show what it looks like when you interrupt that. In addition to the visualizations of the changed process, the benefits we could enjoy, come the stories. The nurse who is overwhelmed in an ICU trying to manage patients and unable to do that because of lack of supplies, lack of equipment. You put these together, these are powerful emotional and cognitive signals to action. Then we need to have a plan. I hate to sound too much like Elizabeth Warren, whom I admire, but so the plans, getting ready for the dance, involve setting up a workforce that can do the contact tracing, setting up testing capabilities so that we can do the testing and identifying whom we're going to test. That implies setting up the supply stream so that we have enough swabs and gowns and reagents and everything else we need for the testing. It involves getting a research program up and running very much along the lines that Angie talked about. There still are big questions to which we don't have answers, and we need the answers. What is the duration and robustness of immunity? What is the efficacy of the various actions we can take and so on? So we need a research program in place. And we need a sort of a social support system in place, because if we're going to start identifying people who are either sick or have been exposed to the sick and make them stay home, we have to have ways to get them food and medicines and basic supplies. So all of that planning is what we have to do next. But to motivate us to do the planning, we need to tell the stories and show the graphics that make us understand collectively that this is what we need to do.
That was really well put. I'm going to show one of those great versions. This was from New Zealand.
Yes.
By a couple of folks down there. It's very simple. And the artist, Mark, has done some other variations, XTOTL, that are fantastic. But this one got around.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, and he's done these more cartoon-oriented ones that are pretty useful for kids too. And again, it gives you that either-or quality. There's two different stories that can play out going forward. And obviously, there's multiple stories that can play out going forward. So Angie, in your realm too, let's go back to the question of what would be a good next step? Is there what do you need, from either the communicators around you or the public health officials around you? Where are the gaps that need filling?
Well, one thing that has been sort of surprising to me, and granted, I'm very new at this communication thing. I started the year off with 200 followers on Twitter, and I have a lot more now. And so I've been kind of learning as I go how to communicate some of these things. But one thing I've realized is that many people, regardless of education level, including some very, very educated people, just don't have a good understanding of how science works at a very basic level. And my own field, which is different than Howie's, it has its own jargon. We might be able to understand each other when talking in, our professional jargon, but not everything. Even within virologists, if a DNA virologist got in here, they'd probably be talking about something with herpes that I haven't really heard that much about. So I think one thing that we really need to work on as scientists is focusing on these tools like visualization, like becoming better storytellers, but also talking about this stuff in a language that people can access. I really strongly believe that the public is hungry for information. That's why I get a lot of responses, positive responses, when I explain a preprint, or I just talk about, this is what a protease is. This is what a virus receptor is. This is what an antibody is. People want to know that, but they want to hear about it in terms of things that they can access and understand from their own experience. They need it to be real for them. I think, though, that generally the public really does want that kind of information. They want to be empowered with an understanding of what's happening so that they can do their part. I think it's very unfortunate that sort of the central message that the public has been getting from our leaders, or at least some of our leaders, has not been very good at explaining the basis for certain decisions. And they may not be themselves focusing on understanding the context of what's happening right now, how to move from the hammer to the dance phase, what that really means in order to communicate that to people. So my hope is that people having this desire to know more and to be more engaged in the public health process, which of course requires the engagement and the buy-in of the public, that the long-term effects of this will be sort of increased interest in science and the scientific process, in research and finding viruses, hopefully as fascinating as I do. Not everybody needs to become a virologist or an epidemiologist, but it would be wonderful to have the public supporting these types of research efforts, to understand why it's important, for example, to know the origins of this virus, or to understand how genetic data can tell us that this virus we don't think was a biological weapon, for example.
Right.
So I'm optimistic that many people seem to be reaching out, looking for those storytellers, for those visualizations that can help them access a better, broader understanding of what's going on. And my hope, again, is that that will sort of continue into the future after we've moved past this crisis.
Boy, this has been, you're leading me to some thoughts here on a to-do list kind of thing. I want to share one more example of a good, this is XTOTL again. He did more of a cartoonish version of this, viruses versus everyone, point one. And this is more sort of a graphic novel variant. It's really kind of cool. And he takes it to through the scale thing. I'm going to fast forward just because we don't have a lot of time. And then it goes to the me scale. So from the micro scale to the me scale, and there's the sneeze. And the significance of hand washing and the like. And it ends up, there's the solution. And then it goes to the mega scale. You know, this is what I call the macrobiome. I have friends like Ed Young who wrote a book about the microbiome. I am multitudes, but there's this macrobiome that we're living in now. That's the thing that's connecting us all, whether we want it to be connecting us or not. And there's his other graphic, and showing the benefits. So, boy, I think there's a lot to do on that front, and integrating more, having more of those conversations. So virologists could say, yeah, well, that's not quite right. But maybe it is, and that's kind of like, I think there's a lot of potential there. And here's the thing that I have the idea about. So maybe Seamus Khan, who's the chairman of the sociology department at Columbia, was one of a bunch of professors and teachers who scrambled starting 3 or 4 weeks ago to build, they built this thing called youthremote.learning.com. It's an online classroom, and you can choose your courses if you're stuck at home, and people who can teach, who aren't necessarily professors, can teach courses, and it's kind of there's a bit of a peer review. But he teaches a course in doing what he does. It's a course in how to be an ethnographer. This for this is grades 6 through 8 or 9 through or high school. So it could be for middle school or high school. And they have a calendar like where he's online teaching the course. So maybe there could be one of these for contact tracing, or for whatever else is needed. Maybe that could fast forward some of the capacity we need. And Howie, I think you mentioned something before we close about high school. I mean, medical schools, and I brought up nursing schools and schools of social work. Like, is there a temporary possibility of redeploying people who have skills of a certain kind right now? Is that another part of the CCC kind of process, or what were you thinking when we were talking about that?
Well, there was a fascinating proposal published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, last week, pointing out that we have a cadre of 20,000 young people just about to enter medical school for the year 2020. They'll be members of the class of 24, and they're set to enter medical school in the fall. What if they all deferred starting medical school for a year? All the medical schools in the country, over 150 of them, just declared a pause. And those 20,000 young people get trained to be public health workforce members, doing contact tracing and the other things they need to do. Add to that the potential of entering nursing students and other health science students. There's an interested, smart, energetic, idealistic, dedicated workforce of tens of thousands of people, maybe sitting there ready for going into action. So it's those kinds of bold ideas I think we need to be considering, both to bring out the best in the country's volunteerism and to get a workforce ramped up quickly. I don't know if that's the best idea, but it's one that's really worth thinking about.
Well, the architecture of the idea is really good because it's who has the potential skill set, who has the distributed geography, the motivation, kind of like public service. If you could get a deferment on your loan or whatever as a medical student, if you do the public service part first. We have that structure already. There are medical students who go to, or doctors who go to work on Indian reservations first, and I forgot what that system is called, but so that architecture exists too. That gets, by the way, on climate too. Even before this exploded, I've been writing about climate change for 32 years, and I recently, as I came to Columbia, I kept thinking more and more that universities should think much more about the old extension service model for what universities can do for society more broadly. Dan Kamen, who I think Howie probably knows from, Dan Kamen is at Berkeley. He was an energy expert from developing countries to the World Bank. And he, in 1997, he wrote a paper with Michael Dove at Yale on what they call the virtues of mundane science, using the word mundane as a provocation, obviously. Useful. Like, what have you done for society lately? And that concept keeps coming back at me too. And I think journalism, even in journalism, there's this tiny little niche called solutions journalism. There's a solutions journalism network. It's still like a tiny component of the conversation in journalism, which is still stuck in old models of success, getting the scoop, getting the page views, as opposed to what have we actually done for you lately, and other than overloaded you with information about this virus, which sometimes seems to be the case. So I think every field has that potential right now to pause, to reflect on, what do we do with our existing strengths and weaknesses to have a more direct impact. And I even frankly, I think for the climate community, I would like to see less of this discussion. Oh, this is really relevant to climate change, and more, well, we've got a really good network around climate change. Can we use it to solve this problem first? Yep. Now, I'll just say one last thing about a week ago on this webcast, I connected directly live with people in Bhopal, India. It's a citizens network there, most of whom knew each other because they were part of a middle-class clean up the plastics campaign, like, reducing plastic trash. But now they're delivering food to slum dwellers in Bhopal using WhatsApp and kitchen capacity in restaurants. So they deployed their existing interests and capacity and communitarian, ethos to the new problem, as opposed to saying, well, plastic still matters too. I don't know. I just think if we all had a little part of us who could kind of do some of that nudgy thing, we'd be heading in a better direction. Tomás, do you have any last manifesto kind of thought? Like, how could there be more of you in that mix of folks out there?
The only thing that I have to add to this is there's one stakeholder that we haven't talked too much about, which is politicians. And right now they are the stakeholder that has probably the most impact on this. And the position is a hard one, right? They are as much of experts as everybody else outside of the actual experts, right? So they have no idea about epidemiology. They need to learn really, really fast. They have hundreds of people telling them from everywhere what they have to do. They are not equipped in many cases to make some of these decisions. And not only from an epidemiology standpoint, but also their stakeholders are not just the people who might get sick. It is also all the other people who are working or who might lose their jobs, or the businesses, the economy. They're thinking about the next election too. And so they're in a very, very hard spot, which is why I think many politicians in the world failed to react properly. They are just humans like all of us. And in many cases, because of the speed of all of these events, they didn't have the mental frameworks to really cope with this and decide what to do. And I think we still see it today. For example, many European countries are starting to talk about the dens and moving into the dens and taking measures to release the pressure. But they're not ready to dance, right? And you can't really understand from the measures, the strategy that they're following. Are they going for herd immunity? Are they thinking that they can keep these controlled? And my guess is it's not a matter of storytelling only. It's also a matter of just they don't know. They don't have a strategy. And and so I think I'm fascinated by how they think and the situation in which they are, and what we can do to help them.
Yeah, I just 2 weeks ago, I think on this program, I'll call it a program, even though it's online, I had on Jan Kwakkel from Delft University and Rob Lempert from Rand Corporation, both of who are experts in decision making under deep uncertainty, which is something the world needs to more on. There's a website, deepuncertainty.org, for their community, and Kwakkel was saying, you've seen the wrong kind of herd behavior in some cases in Europe, where one country decides to reopen their schools and the other country says, okay, we should do that because Sweden's doing it, without thinking about their own geography and their own cultural issues and their own capacities. So that human element, those human dynamics are a lot harder to model than the other aspects of this. It's just been great to have you all here from your different vantage points. And maybe we can kind of reprise this in a month and kind of do a check-in on how things are going, look back at what we thought and see if we've moved the needle at all. And it's been a pleasure to get to know you virtually. Angela, I can't, you're one of many people at Columbia I still haven't met face-to-face. Howie, we go way back. And Tomás, let's stay in touch and let me know when you have your next piece done, obviously. So I'm going to read a little quick boilerplate thing here that I wrote. Sustain What? This conversation is a global online video discussion identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. Although I'll tell you, this virus has traveled maybe almost as fast as a digital virus. I think not quite. This webcast is produced by my new project, Columbia University's Earth Institute Initiative on Communication and Sustainability. For the time being, these sessions will be focused on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by the global spread of COVID-19 illness. But we'll dip into other subjects and solutions when the time is right. So please stay tuned. Share this when it's archived. As soon as I hit end broadcast, this becomes a video that you can share with others. And I think there's a lot of value in the discussion we had today, particularly. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, listeners.
Thank you for having me.
Stay well.
Yeah, and do share this with others. I think the more we can have these kinds of intersectional conversations, the better off we'll be. And stay safe. And once again, just thank you to all those around us who don't have the luxury of sitting indoors with good internet and who are out working to maintain the structures we all rely on. Thanks, everybody.
Amen.